All right, so we're talking about this gentleman. One of the four police officers are involved in the arrest of George Floyd. Of course, really, we're talking about all the George Floyd officers, but it was Officer Tao, former Officer Tao, who was sentenced this past Monday to 57 months in state prison. He already has something like a 3.5-year federal sentence to look forward to. These will run concurrently, however. And the problem with the conviction and with the sentencing is that this officer committed no crime, certainly no crime provable beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the legal standard for guilt in the United States. None of these officers did. And notably, also, we're seeing in the headlines, the news all this week is, of course, lamentations about another propagandized police use of force event, and that is the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Michael Brown, who, of course, attacked a police officer, fought the officer for his gun, got shot, incidentally, in the struggle over the gun. Then later, when pursued by the officer, charged that officer, the very large Michael Brown, much smaller officer, charged the officer to again fight him for control of his gun. The officer shot the charging Michael Brown fatally. This Michael Brown shooting was presented to a grand jury in Missouri, and they declined to indict. By the way, that decision by the prosecutor to present the Michael Brown evidence to the grand jury, and not just the evidence that the Benjamin Crumps, the propagandizers, the racial arsonists want to present it to the grand jury, but all the evidence was presented to the Michael Brown grand jury. And the grand jury declined to indict. Now, that decision to provide the grand jury with all the evidence, including evidence of innocence by the officer who fired the shots, that was a judgment call by that prosecutor who'd been the prosecutor in that district for something like 30 years, and it cost him his career. In the next election, a George Soros-financed opponent with very little experience in the law would win that prosecutor's seat on the promise of reopening the case of Michael Brown, which he did when he was elected, when they threw out the old prosecutor, re-elected the Soros prosecutor. He reopened the Michael Brown investigation, and a few weeks later, he closed it because there was no basis for bringing a prosecution of that officer. The Barack Obama, Eric Holder, Department of Justice, investigated the shooting of Michael Brown for months and declined to bring any charges because there was no foundation, no basis for prosecuting the officer in the Michael Brown shooting. And the same is true here, except here we had a different prosecutor. Here we had, energized by Benjamin Crump and company, these prosecutors in Minnesota were more than happy to engage in a racial lynching of these four officers, who themselves, incidentally, were racially diverse, over the death of George Floyd. Who knows what they were thinking? Certainly they were going to advance themselves professionally, advance their careers, their political prospects. Perhaps they simply didn't want their city to continue to burn. But in any case, these four officers in the George Floyd shooting were simply sacrifices at the altar of progressive fanaticism, including this officer sentenced on Monday, Officer Tao, who really did nothing except stare at a hostile crowd who were threatening the officers as they were attempting to make an arrest of George Floyd. Now, I know that many of you, most of you, didn't watch the actual trial of Derek Chauvin. The evidence in all the cases for the police officers would have been largely the same. Obviously, it was the same event. But I did. And so I'd like to share with you just some of my observations. Obviously, the trial went on for a very long period of time. I can't rehash it all in one show. But just a couple of notable days, because I did blog about the trial proceedings as they occurred every single day. Because I know if you didn't watch the trial, probably all you know about the case is the propaganda. And the propaganda, of course, is that these four officers deliberately murdered George Floyd out of racial animus. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, none of the officers were ever charged with a deliberate killing. Even Derek Chauvin was not charged with deliberate killing. He was not charged with an intentional murder. It's an oddity of Minnesota law that what other states would normally call reckless manslaughter, they happen to call a lesser degree of murder. But Derek Chauvin's conduct, even the conduct he was wrongfully found guilty of, never arose to an intentional killing. It was always at worst a reckless manslaughter. And in fact, it wasn't even that. Certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. So I'd like to share with you a couple of my observations of this case. Now, the sentencing judge here was the same judge who presided over the Derek Chauvin prosecution. It seemed like a not unreasonable judge at the time, but certainly his conduct here at the sentencing, I guess he's just bought in. He's bought into the propaganda himself, would be the kindest way to put it.